to our research series, and welcome to December. Like, I cannot believe it is December and the last month of 2017. But for our last research session of the year, we have working with your IRB or the Institutional Review Board, or we have an alternate title, right? How to Stop Fighting with the IRB? Is that? Because I know there's this ongoing battle. We're very fortunate today to have two speakers, and we have Carly Anderson, who's the director of our IRB, so she's going to be talking from the IRB perspective, the regulation side, and then we have Dr. Frank Dane, who's going to be talking from the consumer perspective or the end user perspective. So together they will be a dynamic duo to help you to learn how to better work with your IRB. So please join me in welcoming Ms. Emerson and Dr.
Thank you. So, you know, the goal of this is really to demystify the IRB process, to make it feel a little bit simpler, to give you an understanding of what the IRB is looking for, and ideally help you through the process. And like we said, we'll be talking about both perspectives there and how to get through the IRB. So today we just want to talk about the purpose and requirements of the IRB and the major pitfalls of applications that sometimes are become frustrating for investigators when they're trying to get through quickly, and how to try and identify and prevent those issues right up front. So I think, you know, we're going to go through a little bit of history because I think that's really important to understand why we do what we do. And these two individuals on the slide are two research volunteers who unfortunately both passed away because of a research study that they participated in. And so, you know, the IRB's goal is really to protect participants. We're not here to make your life more difficult. We're really here to help you think through your research study in depth and to think through what those risks may be. Some of them may be very rare risks or unlikely risks, but we want you to think through them and have protections in place to prevent them. So the first research participant was Ellen Roche. She was actually an employee at Johns Hopkins University. She was enrolled by a physician in another lab who was having his participants inhale hethimexonium, and the purpose of that was to compare lung reflexes basically in patients that were healthy versus patients that had asthma. This was a very healthy 24-year-old. The researcher put the application through the IRB, it was approved, he enrolled his first participant in the study, and this participant exhibited some effects of lung failure basically. It's just minor though, you know, more attributed to a cold, cough, difficulty breathing, some respiratory problems, that type of thing. Ellen was actually the second participant to inhale the medication, which was basically something right off of a laboratory shelf, and very quickly went downhill, developed ARDS, and unfortunately passed away 28 days later. And this was very preventable. The IRB, so Hopkins, actually all research at Hopkins was shut down. OHRP and FDA came in and shut research down. They felt the IRB didn't do their job in doing a thorough literature search, and there was actually evidence from the 70s before PubMed was online and available, and so they didn't go back far enough in the literature that showed that this did cause lung distress in others, and actually was pulled from the FDA approval at one point when they were seeking FDA approval because of this exact instance. And so this truly was preventable. The investigator didn't do their due diligence, and the IRB didn't do their due diligence. And so this, as you can imagine, you know, a multi-million-dollar, probably billion-dollar research facility was shut down for days. And this
what year was that?
This was in the 90s, 1990, 2001. I was thinking 99, but it was 2001. Wow. Jesse Gelsinger, I believe, was 1999. He was a healthy young man who actually waited until he was 18 to enroll in this research study. You had to be 18 to enroll. And so he was born with a genetic deficiency that was often inherited, but in him it was just a spontaneous mutation. He was healthy though. He actually could control his disease through exercise and diet, but there were other babies that were born with more severe, it was an X-linked genetic disease, and some of these babies did not live very long. And so he really wanted to participate because he felt like he was healthy, he had a lot of information to provide to the researchers, and so he enrolled in this gene therapy study. He unfortunately should not have been included in this study. There was another participant that was supposed to take his place. Jesse unfortunately did not qualify for the study, but they still enrolled him anyway. I'm trying to think what levels. I have a note here about what his research levels were. He had, let's see. His ammonia levels were too high for inclusion in the study, and so he should have been excluded. 2 patients before him also experienced adverse effects, and the investigator did not report that. Jesse was the 3rd patient and died very quickly. His father initially was very defensive of the researchers, but as he started hearing more, a lot of the risks were not disclosed to Jesse and his family, and so his father said, they probably wouldn't have allowed him to enroll or would have discussed him not enrolling had they really truly been advised of the effects. And this was at UPenn. So again, big research institutions with large academic research profiles that this happened, and not that long ago. And I can tell you from being at large medical institutions that these are 2 that are well-known faces, young, healthy individuals, but there are a lot of research injuries that you don't always hear about. And I've been at the IRB in a couple cases where it was failure to follow protocol, and research participants were very severely injured. Did not die, but were very severely injured, and they don't typically make it into the newspapers. So, these were more recent in the late 1999s to early 2000s. You can go back a ways to a history of issues that basically have led to the creation of the IRB. The first is the World War II research experiments that were conducted by the Nazis, where people were just, put in atrocious situations and tested on, and there was no consent process there. Then you had Tuskegee, which initially started out as a reasonable research study. It was observational, following male African Americans that were exposed to syphilis. The problem was that penicillin was then invented, and they failed to tell that to these individuals, who then, some of them ended up fathering children that had birth defects and things like that because of having syphilis. Willowbrook was a study that was done on children who were in a home because they weren't able to be cared for by their parents, but the parents actually had to agree to let their child be tested on in order to get care at this facility. And these parents didn't have any other way to care for their children, so there was major coercion there. Milgram experiment on obedience. There's a lot of literature about this. I'm sure if you've taken the city training, you've heard about this, and it's a fascinating study where a investigator recruited actors, as well as he recruited participants and also had actors act like they were being shocked at very, very high levels that could actually lead to death. And the participants were deceived about these individuals being actors. And this investigator, there was kind of a authority of obedience where he was telling them to continue to increase these levels to see how far they would go. And some of these people actually, under the authority of this investigator, did administer what they thought would potentially be lethal shock levels to these individuals. And there was a lot of emotional distress there once these individuals found out that this was research, that these were actors, that, kind of questioning how could I potentially do that. The simulated prison study that was at Stanford, there's a whole movie on that where individuals were randomized to either they did kind of a behavioral analysis up front, but then were either put in a prisoner status or as a guard status. This was in the basement at Stanford. Very quickly escalated out of control, where the guards started abusing the prisoners, and this went on for a couple days. The investigator was really kind of fascinated by what was happening and probably observed it a little too long before somebody else that was involved in the research came in and said, we really need to stop this. The amazing thing about that one was that these participants were told at the beginning, especially the prisoners, that this was optional, this was voluntary, they could stop at any time. Yet none of them did for a little while, and really started to undergo major distress from that. And then the 2 I just mentioned, which were 99 and 2001. So, nobody conducts a research study with the goal to harm anybody, right? That's never the goal. But the IRB's purpose, like I mentioned, is really to get you to think through these things. And we have research regulations right now that have evolved because of those things that happened. The Nuremberg Code was in response to the World War II atrocities that were committed on Nazi prisoners. And then in 1979, the Belmont Report was developed. And so this is basically what the IRB centers a whole review around. In 81, the Code of Federal Regulations were put in place, also known as the Common Rule. the codified regulations in 81, and then the common rule, which basically meant that all these other federal agencies signed on to this, to these federal regulations. And so when we're conducting our review and our application, as Dr. Dane will talk about, this all really centers around things that by regulation we are required to document and to ensure that you have thought through. So the Belmont report focuses really on three things: respect for persons, so treating individuals as autonomous agents, and protecting people with reduced autonomy, so children, prisoners, those that are unable to consent for themselves. And this really does focus around the informed consent process. So we ask a lot of detailed questions about your informed consent process. How are you going to be recruiting these individuals? How are you going to be approaching them? How are you going to ensure that they understand that this is voluntary? We want to see your informed consent document. It should be written at a, an 8th grade reading level if you're recruiting from the general community in the area. If you're recruiting physicians or individuals who are expected to be more highly educated, then there's a little flexibility there, obviously, but it really needs to be a document that everybody can understand. Beneficence. So we are really looking at how you are going to maximize the benefits while minimizing the risk to individuals. And so again, we had to ask a lot of detailed questions about this. Just saying that there are some risks or that the risks are going to be rare, that's not enough, because we really need you to have thought through all the potential risks and how you will minimize them. I was at another IRB when it was another asthma study, and they didn't follow their protocol. So there was supposed to be a crash cart nearby. There wasn't a crash cart. And if they had just clearly followed the protocol and protected the individuals like they said they would in the protocol, the participant probably would have been okay. The individual that was in the study had serious consequences because they didn't follow the protocol, such as having a crash cart, such as having another physician nearby monitoring the person after they engaged in this research. So we really want you to think through those things, and we want very detailed, specific information on how you've thought through these things and how you're going to protect the participants. So justice is the last one, and that's really that the risk should be borne equally by the members of our society. So, there's research used to focus primarily on men, and so women didn't gain a lot of the knowledge that was obtained from that research because it didn't apply to them due to, the circumstances of being a different gender. And then also ensuring that those risks are shared equally among those who may benefit in society. And so thinking about your population and who you're recruiting, how they're going to benefit. If you're excluding someone for no reason, if you're excluding women, we want to know, why are you excluding women? Is it a drug that could potentially impact them if they were pregnant? Well, instead of excluding the women, why don't you then put some protections in place for women that may be of childbearing protection, such as pregnancy tests, having them use birth control, those types of things, so that that population can benefit from that research as well. So really our purpose truly is to protect the rights and welfare of participants. We want to assist you, we want you to do research, we want you to do great research, and we want to publish and all those things, but our primary goal is to protect participants, and that is what our application and our questions to you really focus around. So just to kind of demystify the IRB and what's behind closed doors, the IRB is a committee that is made up of at least 5 members, and these are all required by the federal regulations. There has to be diversity in background, profession, gender, ethnicity. There has to be expertise appropriate to the research. So if we have a study that requires a specific clinical expertise, we have to have that member at that voting board. There has to be 1 scientist and 1 non-scientist at least, and we have community members, people who are, have a legal background or teaching background, those types of things, but are not scientists. And then at least 1 person that's unaffiliated with the research. And so all these are there to protect the participants. Having somebody from the community or having a nurse on board means that they're going to be reviewing the consent document more from a patient perspective versus a clinician perspective. If you're recruiting a specific population that has a specific cultural background, we'll want someone that has knowledge on that culture and what they consider to be cultural norms in their area. So we have 2 committees, each meet once a month. Actually, we have 3 committees, but the one is really convened in emergency settings only. If there's, something that emergency use or something like that, where the committee really needs to meet and there isn't a scheduled meeting right there. Each of our committees, this is reduced a little bit, has about 10 to 15 members. Dan Harrington, Dr. Daniel Harrington, is the VP for Academic Affairs, and he's the institutional official. And so that's who the IRB reports up through. We have an IRB chair, who's Dr. Charlie Schluchner in infectious disease. Our vice chair is Dr. Vaughn. She's an oncologist. I'm the director, and then we also have our research administrator here, Meredith, and Janet is the regulatory affairs individual. Meredith deals mostly with the greater than minimal risk studies. Janet deals mostly with the minimal risk studies. And then we also have Susan, who is our administrative assistant and helps with just keeping the office running. So, you know, things come in, investigators want to do a project, and you need to decide if it really meets the definition of human subjects research, which needs to come through the IRB. A lot of requirements now are just to do QA/QI research or projects, and so if you're unsure, we are certainly always happy to help you walk through that to determine if it is research. Basically, research has to be systematic. It has to be testing and evaluation. It has to be designed to contribute to generalizable knowledge. And so that one's a little tricky, and actually some of the hardest determinations that we make are, is it QA/QI or is it research? Because the line can be very fine there in a clinical setting. If its intent is to contribute to generalizable knowledge, it doesn't mean that it will, but that it could potentially contribute to generalizable knowledge, then would mean that it does meet that definition of research. QA/QI, we'll talk a little bit more about that. But research typically has a hypothesis, and you have conclusions that you're setting out to seek, and you have objectives that you're in a formal protocol that will be met. Then you have the question, is it a human subject? So, living individual about whom an investigator obtains data through intervention or interaction, or identifiable private information. And this has just been expanded to also include identifiable biospecimens. So if you were dealing with any of those, if you have any interactions, then it meets that definition of human subject. To come through the IRB or to be classified as human subjects research, it needs to meet both of those definitions. And Janet is typically the one that can help you walk through that if you're unsure. We have a human subject determination checklist on our website, which talks through the QA/QI application. You can complete that and then send that to Janet, and she'll take a look at it and let you know if we need some more information. And again, like I said, sometimes that line is very gray, and so we will be teasing out specific information from you about how you plan to utilize this data to really make that determination. If it is solely to assess a program or process at Carilion, and it's already being done at other places, and we're just trying to assess its impact here, then typically that would meet that QA/QI definition. If there's not an answer in the literature, if you're looking to answer new questions, if it's something that is, changing the standard of care or those types of things, then typically it will meet that definition of research. So we kind of talked about this. QA/QI is really designed to lead to better patient outcomes, system performance, and professional development. It's really a lot of times observational, or it's things that are already being done, and then you're assessing the value of implementing those activities. It's unobtrusive, it shouldn't hinder care, and it typically has no risk to the patient. So when you submit to the IRB, really the way we look at things, and there is, just to give you a heads up, that the regulations are, as far as we know, there's going to be some changes as of January 19th of 2018, and really right now we have a couple different review types, and that's going to remain, but really what the IRB looks at is it minimal risk or is it greater than minimal risk? And so we'll be talking a little bit more about some of the changes. We're kind of holding off on talking about these too much because there's been some discussion that some of the regulation changes may be revised at the last minute, or they may not actually get published. And so we're holding off on doing a lot of education, but just kind of keep an eye on our website. I'll just give a plug out for that. Because there are going to be some changes in terms of the consent documents. There needs to be a concise summary in the consent form now, which is required by regulations. But basically, when we're looking at a study, we're trying to determine, is it minimal risk, is it greater than minimal risk? If it's greater than minimal risk, it always goes to that full committee that we talked about that's constituted with the scientific and non-scientific, affiliated and unaffiliated members. If it's minimal risk study, then we can actually review it. Either Janet or I can sign off on that, or the chair can sign off on that. It doesn't have to go to the full committee. There will still be a lot of discussion about how you're going to be minimizing risks, or to really think through the risks, but it doesn't have to get assigned to that full committee, which tends to, we have committee meetings twice a month, but you have to take that into account when you're planning for your research. And on our website, we also have a listing of all the deadlines for submission if your study is greater than full board. Greater than minimal risk. The other thing to just put a plug out for is, if you are doing a study that's greater than minimal risk, contact us early on, especially if you're relatively new to research, and we can talk you through the process, help you think through all the issues that may arise that you haven't thought of, and get that process started early for you and help you hopefully reduce frustration in that process. So, there are still 3 classifications of research. The exempt and expedited are both minimal risk studies, and then the full board research. Our application is quite long, and we are actually going to, right now it's paper, we're going to an electronic system. We've already signed a contract. We're in process of developing that. That should be out by spring. The goal is to go live with that in spring, so keep an eye out for that as well. One other thing to mention is that right now we have 2 separate processes. We have the research and development process, which is prior to the IRB, and Francis is here for that. Francis and I are working very closely together to have one application so that you won't have this 2-step process. You'll have to think of put your full application and process up front, and then it will go through Francis's office and then come to the IRB once they sign off on it. So that will reduce a lot of the workload. It's still going to be a lot of check boxes. There will still be places for you to describe in depth your consent process and recruitment process, things like that. But right now it is mostly check boxes with answer sections. All the things that we talk about, research design, how are you going to recruit these participants? How are you going to identify these participants? What are your subject population that you plan to recruit? How are you going to keep that data confidential? That's a really important thing to think about, and a lot of investigators think, oh, I'm just doing a retrospective chart review, I'm pulling some data from the medical record, no big deal, there's no risk to the participant, and that's not true. If your data was released or lost, your laptop was lost, or you had it on a jump drive that was lost, or even you had paper files and it was lost, and it linked this participant to a specific disease status or mental health history or drug use, all those things could really put these participants at risk. And we need to be notified of that because we actually need to report that to the federal authorities. And so making sure you're thinking through, even if it's just a retrospective chart review, if it was you or if it was your parent, or would you want researchers just kind of combing through their medical records? And we certainly allow that and will grant a waiver of consent, but to think through the importance of our patients trusting you with that data and how you're going to protect that data. And Dr. Dane will talk a little bit more, but it's really important to use precise, complete, and lay language as much as possible, especially in the consent form. One of the biggest challenges that we hit is that we have a consent document and we have an application and they don't match up, or they have conflicting information. And so making sure when you're doing this, often having a second set of eyes that maybe is not involved in the research, take a look at it and help you work through some of those issues. So just to talk briefly about informed consent, because this really is an area that we focus on in our IRB review, and we are happy to work with you on revising your consent form and helping you simplify it. But it's typically required if you're doing any interaction or intervention with participants. We will grant a waiver of signed consent if it's a minimal risk study, and so we're happy to talk through that with you as well to determine if your research qualifies for that. But if it's a greater than minimal risk study, and signed informed consent is pretty much always going to be required. If it's a retrospective chart review, we will grant a waiver of that if you can justify certain things, and one of those is that it's minimal risk, that you have the protections in place to protect the data. The informed consent should always include the true purpose of the study. If there's any deception involved, we can help you kind of figure out how to do that. You want to give the participant as much information as possible to let them make an informed decision about whether they truly want to participate. Talking in depth about the procedures, a patient may say, yeah, I'd be interested in that, and then you tell them it's going to take 4 hours of their time, and they may say, you know what, I don't have that amount of time to give to you. Or they may hear more in depth and decide they don't want to participate once they hear the risks of those procedures. And so making sure you're really talking through those. What the alternatives are, and it may be as simple as your alternative is not to participate and just receive your standard care, but there may be other alternatives that you want to talk to them about as well. And then your contact information, so that if there are any emergencies, and typically for greater than minimal risk studies, we do require a 24-hour contact number, so that if participants are at home, they do have somebody to contact, even if it's in the middle of the night. As I mentioned, waivers of signed consent and consent waivers in general will be granted if you justify them. And there are explicit criteria that are on our website, and we're happy to, also in our application, to talk through with you about. So research team responsibilities. The principal investigator, regardless of who is actually developed the study, so even if it's a student or the principal investigator is always ultimately responsible for the conduct of the research. And so the PI needs to make sure that every study team member is appropriately trained and qualified to be conducting this research study. Any changes to your study team need to come through the IRB, and that is because we do just verify that you have the resources and that these individuals are appropriately qualified. We require city training. It's an online training module, which I'll talk a little bit more about on the next slide. And so we verify that those people have completed that minimal training. That doesn't mean that they shouldn't be required by the PI to do additional training. There should be. If it's students who are obtaining consent, we actually have a specific training for the students to be able to obtain informed consent. Unanticipated problems are things that are related to the research or unexpected in terms of severity, duration, or frequency, and they need to be reported to us in a prompt form, and I think our form is within 7 days you need to tell us about those things. And that could be something like a loss of a laptop that contained patient data, participant data with identifiers. That would need to come to us. It would be all the way to somebody, maybe a rash is described as being minor in your research consent form, and then you have a participant who comes in with a very severe rash, that would be reported. Or if maybe it was described as a rash being infrequent or rare, and then your first 4 participants developed a rash, it's no longer infrequent or rare, so you need to let us know about that. And likely what we're going to ask you to do is to look at your consent form and change the language in there so that it truly gives the participants an informed idea of what's happening. So there's a whole bunch of other things, non-compliance you need to tell us about if as a PI or as a coordinator you become aware of not following the research protocol. So we'll be doing some more education specifically on unanticipated problems and other promptly reportable information, because I think this is a big source of confusion. People don't always know what they need to tell the IRB about, so I'm just kind of mentioning that, and then you can look on our website for a form for that information. And every study, at least right now, must be reapproved every 12 months. And this is where one of the changes in the regulations is happening. So study that, research that is minimal risk. If this regulation goes through, there will be a reduced continuing review process. And likely, rather than having a full continuing review for minimal risk studies, there'll be some type of check-in where you give us a little bit of information about what's happening with the study, but it won't be a full continuing review like you're being required to do now with a lot of information about what's happened. And the IRB will always retain the right to request a full continuing review, especially if there are vulnerable populations involved, or if what you're doing for some other reason we have concerns about. And then at the end of the study, please let us know that the study's done. It's really nice for us to be able to close out our records, to also know what is happening in our research community. And it's really just an update in what you've done over the past year, because we should have had these continuing reviews all along the way to know what you've done. So please do notify us. If a student leaves, we have a closure form that we'd really like you to complete, but at the bare minimum, at least say, the student has left, the research is done. At best, please give us a conclusion form. And when we go to the e-system, you will be required to have a conclusion form. Everything will be done through the system. So I mentioned city training. It's an online training module that you can do at your own pace. You can go in and out, stop at any time. There are a bunch of different modules in there. Make sure you're taking the human subjects module for, I think it's biomedical behavioral, right? Right. So there are those 2 options. Responsible conduct of research is not applicable to the IRB. That's more about like plagiarism, fabrication, falsification of data. If you take that, the IRB will not accept that. So make sure you are telling your researchers that it is the biomedical or behavioral human subjects research modules. We require that to be completed by all team members prior to submission. If we get an application and somebody does not have city training, we do not consider that a complete application, and we will return it to you. And we will not start the review process. This was a change about a year ago we made because we were completing our review and then waiting for months for people to complete city. And so we were investing our resources in reviewing your application, but obviously there wasn't the dedication on the researcher's part to move this forward. And so we've decided that it's not a complete application now if everyone hasn't done the appropriate city. We have a lot of resources. Please know that we are really here to help you. We are here to help you think through, how to minimize risks, to talk through what we need in our application. We have a website with a lot of templates and tools. We're happy to talk to you on the phone. If you work in a department where there's going to be a lot of research, we are happy to come in and do office hours there or do an education with your specific department on the types of research that you do. So please use us as a resource. If you have naive researchers, send them to us early on in the process. We are happy to do continue education, and we will be continuing education. And just one more plug, December 15th, Dr. Robert Trussman is doing a session on research with vulnerable populations, and so try and come to that if you were able to make it. So our contact information is on here. This is recorded. We have a website with all that information. And now Dr. Dane will talk about pitfalls.
Thank you, Carly. Oh, wait, you have the clicker.
Oh, wait.
So, my name is Frank Dane. I'm here representing researchers, but full disclosure, I'm also a member of the IRB. I'm on that emergency committee, Committee C, and I've been working with IRBs probably as long as there have been IRBs. I was not involved with any of the studies that were that are used as the examples, but it turns out that from my point of view, IRBs exist mostly because researchers keep screwing up, and like most federal regulations, they're in reaction to something that we decided we didn't want to have happen again. And like most federal regulations, they just keep getting longer and longer because more things happen that we don't want to have happen again. Fortunately, and I think quite amazingly, the people who developed the initial 45 CFR 46, as well as the common rule, and now the modifications that are coming through, have worked very closely with researchers to make sure, and this is really the amazing part, that the regulations are useful to the researchers. So from my point of view, what we're really doing is trying to figure out how to help the IRB accomplish its purpose, which is to protect the rights and welfare of human research subjects. I've never run into a researcher who said, well, no, I wouldn't want to do that. Right? So the problem is not lack of intent, but rather lack of insight. Usually because we're too close to what we're doing. I've served on IRBs, I've chaired IRBs, I helped develop IRBs, I've submitted research to IRBs, and it's never worked to try to wear both of those hats at the same time. It just isn't, I think, psychologically possible. You either have to be a researcher or somebody looking at the research. Being both doesn't work because when we're in the middle of a research project or planning a research project, we're too far inside of it to be able to see what implications it might have for someone who doesn't know all of the background that we know. So what the IRB does is approval and continuing oversight of the research. What they need is enough knowledge about the research to be able to do that. That's our job, is to give them that knowledge, right? So from the viewpoint of what the IRB needs to know about, if it is, it's not working. You don't need to see me point to things.
I'll look for another one.
No, that's fine, that's fine.
Okay.
I've got my own if I really want it.
Okay.
As Carly just mentioned, the IRB needs to know about the research team. And according to the feds, that's everybody who's going to come in contact with the participants or their identified information, which is, again, how the feds define human subject, right? It's not only the actual person, it's the person's information as well, as long as it's identified. Once it's been de-identified, it doesn't count anymore. So probably the statistician needs to be included on the research team. The person who's going to take consent or get consent needs to be included. If it's a different person, the person who files the consent forms needs to be included because that person is going to see the participant's name. Right? So thinking through, one of the things that I've run up against in terms of wearing the research hat is not thinking through the research team enough. You know, and then turn something in, and the IRB says, yeah, but who's going to obtain consent? You don't mention the person who's going to do that. Crap. I don't. I got to put Bob on here, or whoever it is. Right? So thinking through the research team very effectively is going to be helpful. We all are encouraged to involve external collaborators as much as possible. So that means they too need to be included. Just because the person who's going to analyze the data is somebody from tech doesn't mean that doesn't make them a member of the research team. Right? If it's a multi-institutional project that's going through their own IRB, then the folks from the other institution don't need to be included. You're just writing about the local team. But if it's a project that's yours, in which you involve other folks, IRB needs to know about it. They need to know why you're doing the study. Right? So in the study protocol, they want an abstract, they want a background, they want objectives, they want study design, they want study population, they want methodology, data collection, and statistical analysis. Why? Because the IRB's job is to assess risk, including the risk of wasting participants' time. And that's been a ruling from Office for the Protection of Human Research Subjects for many, many years. Right? So if you're designing a garbage study, right, there is no benefit to offset the risk of the participants' time. So the IRB needs to know enough about your study to decide whether or not what you are asking them to do is worth their time. What you may find out from the research is worth their time. That's the point that always seems to annoy researchers the most. Right? Because none of us would ever design a garbage study. Right? Who here has never included a methodological flaw in their research? And I'm a methodologist. We can't see it because we're too far into it. So we have to be able to explain it to other people. Carly mentioned what IRBs are like. They're a mixed group. They're not all the other people, all 6 of them, who are doing research just like mine. They're everybody else. They don't have a clue until we tell them. And so we need to be able to explain it in lay language, right? Because the optimization of statistical power in mixed group, multi-hypothetical construct verification is not quite understandable to everybody. That's not what I do, I just made that up. Sounded impressive though, didn't it?
We have wonderful IRB members whose standard seems to be, would my mother understand what you're talking about doing?
Yes.
Or would this confuse my mother? And it's a good standard.
It is, because if we can't do that, if we as researchers can't explain our research to people who don't know what we're doing, they can't make the determination, and we probably shouldn't be doing the research. If we're so far into it that we can't explain it to somebody's mother, knowing that it could take quite a long time if you start with what statistical power is and have to move on from there. Right? But if we can't do that, then we've sort of lost track, at least I think we've lost track of what our research is for. Which eventually I found out was not, as I learned in graduate school, to get publications and to get tenure and promotion and all those things. It's actually to contribute to human good, the public good. Right? I mean, that's why NSF and NIH and lots of other federal agencies are willing to give us hundreds of millions of dollars to do our research. Or, you know, why Jefferson College will give you $2,000 to get started. Because it's supposed to produce something that's worthwhile. Oops. Before I tell you the secret, I am supposed to go through the application. This needs to be bigger, doesn't it? I'm not used to a computer with 2 screens. Here's all the stuff about who are on the team. There actually is a way to add more people. Right? And they tell you right there. So failure to include the team is generally failure to follow instructions, which in my experience is also a reason for an unsuccessful IRB application. I do acknowledge that there is a difference in the definition of successful and unsuccessful as far as researchers in IRB are concerned. Right? From the IRB's point of view, an unsuccessful application is one that doesn't enable them to make a decision about the research. Sound fair? From the investigator's point of view, an unsuccessful application is one in which they don't call you an hour after you submit it and say, please start this as soon as possible. Somewhere in between, probably closer to the IRB's definition, is the real definition. Right? Again, we need to step outside of our own timetable, our own research protocol ideas, and try to understand what it is that others need in order to enable us to do our research. Right? We know we need lots of stuff to do our research. Money's always at the top of the list. Personnel are always second. But IRB approval is third. Because the feds have a very large stick. Right? Carly mentioned people's research being shut down. That's happened. Institutional research has been shut down for a while. The big stick they have, they've come close but never using, is elimination of all federal funding. Imagine Carillion without federal funding. No federal money at all. Not just NIH grants. Medicare, Medicaid. It wouldn't exist anymore. And there are a few institutions that don't have IRBs for this reason. Interestingly, Bob Jones University is one of them, because they also choose not to accept federal funding so they don't have to follow civil rights law. But beyond that, places that don't involve U.S. federal funding, like other countries, have also adopted all of these regulations because it's also a good thing to do. We don't want people to badmouth our research. To this day, we have huge difficulties recruiting African Americans for any kind of health-related research as a result of the Tuskegee study. To this day, people still look around for the cameras and the shock machines when they go into a psych lab because of Milgram's research. Milgram's research, and for that matter, Phil Zimbardo's research, were done before there were IRBs. Right? They didn't violate any rules, but their inability to see what was happening soon enough have caused problems decades into the future. As Carly mentioned, the application is basically checklisted. Right? It's really simple to fill out. Have you ever been suspended or terminated by an IRB? Yes or no? You're done. Right? Move on. Right? It doesn't mean you can't, even if you have been, it doesn't mean you can't do the research. Fill out the application and move on. I think a lot of folks get caught up in wondering, why do they need to know that? In part because what are they called? They're not the regs, the letters that come out from OHRP.
483.
The guidelines?
Guidance.
Guidance, thank you. The guidances have included along the way specific things for dealing with potential repeat offenders. Okay? So somebody's rarely banned from doing any more human subjects research. But if you're the kind of person who's already demonstrated that you can't follow protocols, then the IRB is probably going to want to add a few additional oversight mechanisms to make sure that maybe that you've learned your lesson. Right? If you've not been suspended or terminated, answer no and move on. Right? The question doesn't apply to you. You don't have to do anything. Where will the research take place? Check boxes. For those of us who don't do drug, device, and biologic studies, Section 2 is wonderful. You just check one box and move on. For those of you who do, yes, there's a lot they want to know about the drug or device or the biologic. Right? If you don't know how to answer those questions, you're not ready to do the research. Right? Here's the study protocol where they want all of this information. Take it from your research protocol, which should be written in advance if it's going to be good research, and copy and paste it. And then look it over and say, can somebody's mother understand this? And then revise. And then have somebody else look it over and say, can somebody's mother understand this? Eventually you get the hang of revising the research protocol into something that somebody else's mother can understand.
And a good thing is, and what always makes it more palatable for me, is if I'm thinking, if I write this really well, I can use this as an abstract for anything in the future when I'm submitting to a journal or I'm submitting to present this at a conference, and it makes me hone in on what would they want to know also.
Mm-hmm. And none of this is one-time only information, unless you're the kind of researcher who does a project in this area and then moves to an entirely new, different area and does another project, and then moves to an entirely new, different area and does another project. Right? Most of this stuff is copyable, pastable, minimally revisable information. Once you've done it, once you've explained why it's necessary to study statistical power in multi-hierarchical regression, it's explained. And you don't have to do it again. Right? You just copy that for the next study. The section on risks and benefits is the one that gives most people the most trouble. Because, of course, unless people are going to die, it must be minimal risk. Okay, maybe arterial spray, then below that, minimal risk. But that's not what this asks you to do. It says, describe all costs. Subject may incur, right? May incur. They could decide they've wasted their time. They might get annoyed at the phrasing of the questions. Right? Even if it is minimal risk, it's still not zero risk. Because in the viewpoint of the feds, and therefore the IRB, there's no such thing as zero risk research. So describe the costs, and then describe the risks, and then describe how you're going to minimize those. Right? We have a strong methodological design that is the best it can be to test our hypothesis. Therefore, it is extremely unlikely that this will be a waste of the participants' time. Ba-dum-bum. Right? And the goal is not to make you jump the hurdle to answer the question, but rather to make you, and I use that verb intentionally, consider all the risks and costs that you're putting your participants through. Right? To think through your study from the viewpoint of somebody else's. How are you going to recruit people? None of these questions are unanswerable. All of them should be easily answerable. If they are not, then you probably need to do some more thinking about your project. What's showing? I can't tell. So it's time for the secret. Should be able to guess it by now. Just do what they want. Right? Our institution has decided to accept federal money, which means it's responsible for following federal regulations, which means there's an IRB. The only way to avoid an IRB is to go to your research at Bob Jones University. There's another small college in Michigan that doesn't take federal funds for the same reason. And I can't remember its name. It doesn't even do any good to go to a different country, because unless it's maybe Syria or someplace like that, everybody's signed on to the Helsinki Accord, which is based on IRB regulations as it's been revised. So everybody's doing the same thing. And as I pointed out, if you can't fill out the IRB application, I think easily, except for maybe having to revise so somebody's mother could understand it. And writing's never easy, but if you can't do it, step back, learn more about your research, and then submit. So Carly has mentioned all the staff members. They're all available on the IRB site. If you want additional help, in addition to calling or emailing them, if you would like, for example, an informal review of your application or a piece of your application, does this sound like somebody's mother could read it? Call me, send an email to me. I'm happy to help. Teaching people how to do research is what I do for a living. So it's not really a big ask. And it's something that I like doing, which is why I keep doing it for a living. So it's really not a big ask. And so I guess we should say, are there any questions for either Carly or me? So I guess knowing the secret has overwhelmed everyone. All right, cool.
Thank you all so much.